Welcome to this episode of Washington in Focus. I'm your host, TJ Martinell. With me is our reporter, Tim Klauser, and we're going to be discussing a significant election coming up this November, and it's going to concern the state's high court, the state Supreme Court. So, Tim, let's talk. Why does this matter? What's the context for these races?
Well, there's 5 of the 9 seats on the Washington State Supreme Court up for election this year, which is, I believe, the most seats up for election at any given point in recent record. So, outside of any other context, very substantial. But why this matters so much right now is that the state just passed a new income tax, which the state constitution prohibits. The Democrat Party is looking to get the court to overturn that ruling. And there's currently a lawsuit in Clickitat County Superior Court, which is expected to eventually reach the Supreme Court in the next year or two. So the outcomes of these elections could play a big part in how that ruling could come down in the next year or so, whether or not the bench upholds the state income tax and allows this to proceed forward, potentially opening it up to a progressive income tax that could land on everyday Washingtonians instead of high earners, or if the voters decide to take a different route and elect the challengers coming for these seats, we could see somewhat of an ideological shift on the bench and potentially see it reject the state income tax and uphold the state constitution, which looks at income as a form of property. So definitely a big deal here. This income tax right now, it's 9.9% on annual earnings over $1 million. So targeted at those high earners, but it was largely framed, as you know, TJ, as a way to get the court to reconsider its 1933 ruling and to potentially push a progressive income tax in the future. So these races, a lot of times you see lower turnout than other major elections, like the presidential election. But this one really matters because for the everyday Washingtonian, not the people that are making $1 million a year, but people making $50,000, $60,000 a year, how you vote now could impact your wallet for not only years to come, but decades. This is a pivotal moment in state history.
Yeah, it's interesting because our state Supreme Court is elected. It's not appointed. I mean, you can't. We've had 2 people appointed recently because there was justices that resigned, but they're typically elected to those positions, and they have to maintain those positions by running for re-election, which is completely different from our U.S. Supreme Court, where it's basically as long as you are willing to and capable of fulfilling the roles. And so you've got people like, Clarence Thomas, who's been on the U.S. Supreme Court since I believe the late 80s, early 90s, so for a really long time. Whereas here, if people don't like the way that the court has been ruling, they can deal with it directly through an election. But as my story broke earlier this week, the what's at stake here is that this millionaires tax is not meant to be a tax on millionaires. It's meant to trigger a lawsuit that's going to get in front of the state Supreme Court, and in which they're going to address the question of income as property. And so it was really it could come down to a lot of these races where people are going to be wondering of these justices, is this a person who understands that income is property or not? And so, it's interesting because I can't think of a instance like this where the election is going on, the races are going on at a time when a decision's going to be getting in front of it. And so that's going to be part of the campaign is, are you going to uphold the state's prohibition on a progressive income tax? Or are you going to overrule, 90 something years of legal rulings by the state Supreme Court and say that it's not property? Which I think what's interesting is it's worth noting that Senator Peterson in his emails talked about overturning Colton, but Colton is just one of many decisions where the state Supreme Court said, income is property, income is property, income is property, stop coming to us, income is property, go to the voters and see if they will pass a progressive income tax. And the first time that they went to them after the 1933 Colton decision was 1934, and voters overwhelmingly rejected the constitutional amendment. So, 10 years back in 2010, there was Initiative 1098. So we're getting to this point where I think proponents of a progressive income tax have tried the voting way, going through the voters. Voters keep saying no. So now they're trying to go through the state court. And that's kind of the context, because I think that there's a separate thing that it maybe isn't being addressed or emphasized enough is that Peterson used the word force in his email. I want to force the Supreme Court to take up this issue. If I was running for office for the state Supreme Court, I would not look favorably on what I would perceive to be manipulation by lawmakers.
Yeah, I think it's important too to zoom out a little bit. You mentioned the recent there's been two appointments in the last few months to the state Supreme Court. So if a justice decides to leave the court before the end of their term, the governor has an opportunity to appoint a justice, and then that justice would then have to go up for election in the next general election to retain that seat. But five or six of the nine justices currently on the panel were appointed by the governor, whether Ferguson or Governor Inslee or the governor before him. And with these low turnout races, it's really easy to get appointed and
Right.
then win as an incumbent. A lot of times you see these justices run unopposed. So they get nearly all the votes. And when you do have someone that fulfills the end of their term, like in 2024, we saw two races with people that weren't on the bench currently, Sal Magia and Dave Larson. That came down to the nail, and Sal Magia barely won that. But the timing of these endorsements is important. And you saw Ferguson as they're proposing this millionaires tax, which is now in place, the state income tax. He made two appointments to the state Supreme Court. One who joined in January, right when they had proposed it, and one that joined earlier this month after that they had passed the state income tax. And that first appointment, Colleen Medley, she used to work underneath Ferguson, the governor, when he was the state attorney general, as you know. In the records that you uncovered in your story, TJ, you have the person that endorsed her to Ferguson, the Solicitor General Noah Purcell, um, later discussing with Senate Majority Leader Jamie Peterson how they could get the court to reconsider its 1933 ruling. I think it's really hard not to look at that in the grand scheme of these entire races, especially considering that she worked under Ferguson, she worked under the current AG, the Solicitor General endorsed her, and now she could have a say on whether or not this tax could hit everyday Washingtonians.
Right. And I think the context of that as well is that the Attorney General's office was actively working on this bill for the purpose of overturning a Supreme Court ruling. And so now you have somebody who was with the Attorney General's office at that time who's now going to be on the state Supreme Court. And so it really begs the question of I understand someone will say, well, she wasn't directly involved, she didn't craft the bill, she wasn't working on it. I okay, but she was recommended by somebody who did. And it just goes back to with attorneys, they're supposed to avoid even the appearance of a conflict of interest. And this is something that I've covered with the Attorney General's office where there's just been numerous even if one could argue that it's not a conflict of interest, but there's the appearance of a conflict of interest. And so, it will be interesting to see if some of the justices will recuse themselves because I mean, the question then is, let's say that it gets in front of the state Supreme Court and they declare that income is not property, and their legal argument is basically, they start talking about social inequities, socioeconomic inequalities, our unfair tax system, stuff that has nothing to do with addressing the actual arguments made in court. And to be fair, the Attorney General's office acknowledged in their legal memo to Governor Ferguson because his office asked about, if we did a millionaire's tax, what would what would the legal issues be? And they said they acknowledged we have a kind of a tall order. We have to explain why 95 years of legal rulings are wrong and what they got wrong. They are also going to have to provide new legal arguments because if they rely on old ones, it's going to be difficult for them to say they're saying that courts in the past have been wrong we're not talking one decision. We're talking numerous decisions over almost a century. It's not like one decision was made and then they overrule it. Right.
Yeah. And this has been on the ballot 10 times in the last 100 years. 11 times in total. The first time before the 1933 decision, the voters had approved an income tax. 1933, we got that ruling. Next year, voters rejected it. 10 times since 1933, voters have rejected an income tax. The state Supreme Court has rejected it, ruled over it 3 times. I mean, this is something that's well rooted in our state constitution, and if they do overturn that and set this new precedent, it will be interesting to say the least what happens to our state economy, especially with concerns over capital flight.
Well,
Um,
I think the other thing is this is another, and I don't, it's not relevant whether they care. It's more of just anticipating what message is being sent. Is that it's all effectively, if they do say income is not property and they don't provide sufficient arguments for explaining why Colton at every other decision was wrong, what they're effectively saying is your income does not belong to you. Your income is not your property. The legal ramifications of that could be immense because I could then theoretically I could go steal someone's money. I'm arrested and charged, and I can say I can't be arrested for stealing something that they didn't that doesn't belong to them.
yeah, well, it completely undermines the state statute around income theft because that looks at income as a form of property. So
Right.
if employers withholding wages, I mean,
Right.
you could make the argument that income isn't their property. They would have
Right.
to. There's a lot of things that if the court overturns this ruling, there's a lot of things that the legislature is going to have to go back and address and fix because of this.
Yeah, I think the other thing is the message being sent is that it's about power, and this is at a time when a lot of people are not paying their car tabs as a form of protest. So if the state isn't going to follow the law, the rule of law, what the message it's going to send to private citizens is I'm not going to follow the law if I can get away with it. And as we've learned, and as we've seen in society, when enough people stop following a law, it's impossible for them to enforce it.
Mhm.
So what other I mean, it got so the car tab issue, it's separate, but it's people saying if the state doesn't follow the law, why should I? And if I can get away with it like them,
Yeah.
why should I? And it's gotten so bad the state lawmakers wanted to make it so you could arrest people who didn't pay their car tab because I mean, we're if the Supreme Court does overturn Colleton and a progressive income tax is enacted, we could see some very politically volatile situations in Washington state. And so that's kind of the stakes that's what's
Mhm.
at stake potentially with these Supreme Court races.
Yeah, and to give readers a little bit of a heads up for the races ahead, there will be an August primary where they narrow these 5 races down to 2 candidates. If there's more than 2 candidates in the running, and then it'll come down to the November election to see who ultimately wins these races. Right now, there's 12 candidates that have filed or registered their campaigns with the state's Campaign Finance Disclosure Commission. But the official state candidate filing period isn't until May 4th to May 8th. So we could see more people join the field. We could see some of these candidates drop out before then. But it's going to be in the next 2 weeks that we see who is going to ultimately be in the running for these races. And right now, there is a few conservative challengers in some of these positions, but there's not a lot of money behind them aside from Dave Larson, who is running for one of these spots. But it'll be interesting to see who emerges because if come filing week, we find out that some of these judges are running unopposed or they're running against other ideologically aligned just or candidates that might issue a same ruling to them, it's not going to have much of an impact. So the next 2 weeks uh, are very important to say the least as to what will happen in November.
Gotcha. Well, we're definitely going to be keeping an eye on this and providing as much coverage as we can. So thanks, Tim. Listeners can keep up with this story and others at thecentersquare.com. I'm your host, TJ Martinell, and thank you for listening to this episode of Washington in Focus.